Trinitarianism that that's not the issue. In other words, even when you have what looks like a flat-out enunciation of the temple cult, that the temple cult has no place and no meaning, by the time you get to the end of the same chapter, the temple cult is back there. I think we just need to remember that in the ancient world, any sort of worship, devotion, connection to a deity that had no temple and no cult was considered almost unthinkable. It was atheism, as far as most people in the ancient world were concerned.
Larry, do you have something?
Yeah, there's a theme in one of you comment about Paul's, Isaiah's influence on Paul. The thing that I see in Paul is the glory and the suffering linked together. Every time that I can think of, Paul mentions the glory, he always mentions the suffering. He puts them together. And like in Romans 8, where he says the sufferings of this present time not worthy to be compared with the glory. Or 2 Corinthians 4:17, where he talks about our light affliction, which for a moment works for us far more exceeding eternal weight of glory. And it seems to me that I see that theme in Isaiah. When you've got these first 39 chapters ending with this, you're going to fall into the hands of Babylon, and then immediately in chapter 40, comfort you, my people. And I'm intrigued with the fact that not only Christians who read from Paul, but Jewish people in the midst of their suffering have always had a hope. It's sustained them in such a marvelous way. And can we not trace that back to Isaiah's influence?
Is that a question for
me?
me?
Yeah, I'd like your comment.
I don't know, because I thought through that. I would have to look through that motif and see where it comes from. That's not something I've done. So I'd have to see whether that's something shared uniquely by Paul and Isaiah, or whether I can find it in a number of other places, not having anything to do with Isaiah, and I have not done that work.
But it is in Isaiah.
Yeah, oh, sure.
Apropos of that, may not have anything to do with it. Leah and I went to visit a young man in the hospital. He has a horrible case of cancer, and they took out his stomach. He's about maybe a third of what he was. He is a Muslim, and his father is a Muslim, and they talked about glory in their suffering. So I'm just wondering if it's more generic or more spiritual, and or maybe connected to not just necessarily looking at Isaiah, but when a person is suffering, you could simply say, oh, it's terrible. And that's about the end of it. Or you could say, maybe suffering has a meaning. I think that's the psychology of the human.
It seems like in Paul, the glory comes out of the suffering. At least that's my take on it. It's the glory that shall be, the suffering not worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed. It seems like one grows out of the other.
Yeah, but I mean, off the top of my head, I think that's as much as anything a Christological pattern, because that's the passion narrative. So you have the torture and crucifixion, and as bad as you can get, and then you have this glorification to the right hand of God and so on. So he's repeating that pattern in his own experience.
We see the same thing even in the Exodus, don't we? I mean, that's a biblical motif where you go through the wanderings, you go through the wilderness, you go through the disbelief, you go through the hard times to make it into the promised land. I think we see that repeated not only in Isaiah, but throughout the whole biblical context. Steve?
I thought in Emanuel Tove's lecture there were two areas that disagreed with James Charlesworth's position. One was that because we have no additional copies of Isaiah that indicate a difference between Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2, that I thought you were maintaining, I might be misinterpreting it, that therefore there probably was viewed in one book throughout based on the evidence of Qumran. And the second point that you made that seemed again a little different than Professor Charlesworth was that if you look at the Qumran documents, that the voice in the wilderness that we started off our seminar with seemed to have a different interpretation. You put, I think, a colon after it on the grounds that if you looked at the rest of the sentence, it seemed to have a parallelism that required it not to be a source of change, but rather the location of a new description. And I was wondering, I might be wrong in my interpretation, that's what I heard, And if that's correct, perhaps Professor Charlesworth could tell us how his reaction is to that area of criticism. Am I out of line in asking that question?
You're certainly not out of line. I want to, can you sharpen it? I was trying to follow, we worked.
2 thought points. Number one, there was one author in Qumran because one author of Isaiah because we have no variations in Qumran. Number 2, at least what I heard, was that because the voice of the wilderness goes on to provide a parallelism in terms of what that means, that the terms should not be read together in terms of a voice of a wilderness for a cause, but rather a voice of a wilderness as a location for a new direction. That's what I heard.
Well, on the first matter, what I said is basically we have simply no evidence. That's all I can say. That doesn't mean that we know anything about what happened at the time when the Dead Sea Scrolls were written. They were too late. There's nothing we can do about it. And all scholars will agree that whatever happened, because the book of Isaiah was way before that time anyway. So we wouldn't even expect something as late as the 2nd century BC. It's too late. I mean, just by the same token, if there ever, I mean, I've written a study on the following topic. The issue of source criticism for the Torah. Were there 4 sources? J, E, P, and D. It's an interesting thing in its own right, obviously, but I studied the text critical background of this, and this is being published pretty soon. And basically what I said is there's no evidence on this topic from any source. And so that basically the scholars who studied and made assertions based themselves on the printed editions of the Masoretic text. Now, what does this mean? It means nothing. It means that whatever happened, if it happened with regard to the drawing together of 4 sources or 3 sources for the Torah, happened not in the 3rd century, maybe not in the 4th century, but in the 5th century or 6th century. That's all it means. And this is parallel to the issue of Isaiah. It was too early. But it doesn't mean that I can either prove or disprove the theory of what the so-called documentary hypothesis. That's point 1.
The Septuagint provide any information on the Isaiah issue?
Nothing. It's all much too early. And basically, I mean, the scholars who started the documentary hypothesis based themselves, as expected, on printed editions of the Hebrew Bible. And if you ask me, it's still correct. I mean, in retrospect, that was correct at the time, and it's still even correct today, because it's all hypothesis anyway. The second issue, I gave the example of Isaiah 40, verse 3, only as an example, no theory, only as an example of different interpretations. And I didn't want to prove anything, but if you ask me if I want to prove, I mean, what you can learn from what I learned myself is that that there's no doubt in my mind that Kol Koreh, stop, Bamidbar Panu Derech is the original interpretation, the one that was intended by the prophets. I've no doubt about that, and that the other interpretation is secondary. And in the case of John the Baptist, this is quite logical, because that's what he did in the desert. And when I say secondary, I mean non-original. And I think most scholars will agree to this. And it has implications for your understanding of the New Testament.
Judge?
I've got something on to pick up with Pastor Claire about suffering, where 2nd and 3rd Isaiah talk about God hiding his face. Israel's 3rd Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah speaks of God hiding his face or his presence. Isaiah 57, Isaiah 59, Isaiah 64, as well as Isaiah 54. Also cross-referenced in the Psalms. And when Jesus was crucified, is there somewhere some allusion to when Jesus cries out from the cross, "Why have you forsaken me? Why has your presence gone out from me?" Is there some parallel influence there?
In the Gospel of John, I think there is a direct link between glory and suffering. John 1:14, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. And then, of course, the rest of the Gospel explains that. And for John chapter 12, Jesus' glory is directly linked with his suffering, with his death on the cross. Also, John 17, Father, glorify your name. He is praying to be crucified. So that link is certainly directly there. And I think that certainly comes from Isaiah. In chapter 6 in Isaiah, we have the prophet beholds God's glory filling the temple. Then we have the smoke coming from the altar there. So you've got glory with the altar, the smoke. You've got those themes interconnected there. Professor Charlesworth?
I just finished the critical edition, or the work on the audio, and I was surprised. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. In the Hodiot, I found that it was quite surprising that the author, so often anonymous, not the alleged passages that are to the Mori Hasidic, over and over and over again, I thank you for giving me suffering. I praise you that I have suffered so much. In fact, there's some passages that almost all of us say, if anything goes back to the Mori Hasidic, it's this one. The one I'm thinking about. So I'm shifting from other passages. My arm is out of the socket. I am tortured. Thank you, God, for delivering me and giving me this horrible pain. And it's quite stunning. That makes the point. And didn't you write an article on glory in John?
Yes.
Yes. Where did you publish that so we can remember?
It's going to be published with Erdmans later this year.
Okay.
Under what title?
I forgot. But it's in a book by Macquarie University called Emergent Christianity. They are doing a series on the Gospels, Paul, and later New Testament documents.
And related, appreciating the suffering, and thank you, Lord, for helping making me suffer. Isaiah 26:19 also talks about the hope of resurrection. Quote, "Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead." So there's a hope in this. There's also a connection to Ezekiel 4:37. So a hope of resurrection. These bones, or the body, or so the corpses will rise. So related to God's presence and his face turning away and then coming back and raising. So a hope there.
Miroslav?
Yes, what is common for the people who quoting? What is common for the people who are quoting Isaiah, who are influenced by Isaiah, Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, Qumran people, they are all Jewish people. But also they are all living in celibacy. And it is very strange for a Jewish style of life. My question is the eschatological thoughts of Isaiah so influential for them that they choose such a contra-normal life, style of life, and are these thoughts support their choice, because it's not only one thought, there are not only words, but it is style of life. This is life they are living, and it is something which is very important for them.
Could I make a comment on that? I recommend that you look at a very crazy, but still very, very perceptive sociological study by a man named Louis Kozer. And the book is called Greedy Institutions. And it's about institutions that demand a sacrifice of identity, particularly a sacrifice of biological identity, particularly a sacrifice of sexual identity. And Kozer has examples that run, what makes it a crazy book is, of course, he has examples that run the whole gamut of history, geography, etc. But the sacrifice of biological sexual identity is a very important human phenomenon that I think, as counterintuitive as we may find it to be, is very, very prevalent. So have a look at Kozer. It's also a lot of fun to read, even if it's also a little bit crazy.
Tom, did you have something?
I suppose back to the point of the Congress, what I've been getting rates today is to look for the discontinuity between the different generations of the writing of Isaiah, or the different, let's say, the different writings. And as you mentioned, the disciples seem to be drawing from the latter, third Isaiah, a number of times, specifically there. What other specifically, I think for Dr. Tobe, what other we talked about how second Isaiah doesn't see God the same way, and robed in a having a form in Shalom Paul's lecture. Is there anything else you can see between the three different sections of Isaiah that would show discontinuity?
I've been asked this question maybe in a different way about whether I see different types of exegesis of first, second Isaiah. But right now I pass on this question, and maybe my colleagues have to say something.
Well, let me drive back to your specific question, what you raised again about the voice crying. I can accept that John would write it, that John would lean on the Septuagint. He seems to be quoting the Septuagint.
I didn't say that.
No?
No. I mean, tradition leaned on the Septuagint.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know enough about the New Testament, so I don't know whether it was John or whether it was tradition who connected John with the desert. So I don't know enough.
All right. But Matthew and Mark pitch it that way, or Peter through Mark, the writer, is also pitching that way. And the tradition tells us that Matthew is more of a Hebrew writer, pitching to a Hebrew audience. Why would he too also be using the language of, let's say, what would be more encapsulated into the Septuagint or something later?
I leave this to my New Testament colleagues. I don't know enough.
Well, would there be any comment on that, or is there something that...
But if I understood Professor Tove's argument correctly, like, there's no real tradition. I think the tradition is our modern English translation, tradition of our translations. Because with the Hebrew, as with the Greek, you can put the comma before in the desert or after in the desert. The text.
No, I didn't say that. because already in the New Testament, you have John the Baptizer in the desert. So the tradition, that interpretation was created then. But that's all I can say. I don't, yeah, it's, I mean, just in the same way, or, I mean, there's the tradition of the virgin birth. It's a tradition.
Could I say something on this? I think I hear that when Professor Tove talks about a secondary interpretation of that verse and argues that the primary meaning of the verse and the meaning as he understands it as having been intended by the author is dictated by the parallelism, and there I agree with him completely. The parallelism is absolutely so strict that it leaves no other choice. But when you hear secondary interpretation, does that have a derogatory ring to you? I don't think you need it with a derogatory.
No, it's not derogatory, no.
What?
No, it's not derogatory, it's simply interesting.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is it's post-third Isaiah way of thinking, and the way in which they're quoting, or the way in which they're expressing or interpreting, or their exegetical point of view of the text. You know, that says something about them, what they're leaning on in terms of the text. Maybe perhaps they're quoting from Isaiah themselves as well, the more eschatological interpretation of the text.
1 second though, I'm sorry, this really is not my area, but whether or not this interpretation is John himself or goes back to John, I think it's also an example of what Professor Tove talked about as actualizing. It's a version of actualizing.
They read it this way because it fits what they're talking about so well. They're not concerned with the original Hebrew sense. They're looking at it saying, we can read it this way, and this will apply to John, to this guy in the desert, because that's where he is.
Well, it already applied to the Mori Hatzedek, didn't it? In
It's like in the Pesher of Habakkuk that talks about the enemies as the Kasdim. In the Pesher, it's the enemies, they're Kittim, and it talks about the Romans. Well, obviously that's, well, the word Romans is never used, but it's clear it's the Romans, and this is the way it goes. I mean, Morea Tzedek comes from the Bible, and in the scrolls it's a certain person who's called Morea Tzedek, which means incidentally Hamorea Tzodek, the teacher who is right, not a righteous teacher. And we have millions of such examples.
Danny, did you have something?
I have a question, because I'm really not from the New Testament stuff. I try to follow all the mentionings of Isaiah, which are in the New Testament, which you mentioned. If I remember correctly, probably I omitted some, but you have Isaiah 40 verse 3 in at least 3 or 4 places. Only that from Isaiah 40, right? Or am I wrong?
I didn't cite anything from Isaiah 40, but without a concordance, I'm not going to tell you whether there's something else there. There probably is some allusion somewhere, but I'd have to look at it.
Okay. So, from what I understood from this lecture, and I don't know anything else, you had Isaiah 40 verse 3, then you had 52 and 53 and 61, and if I remember correctly, I can't remember any other reference.
Well, I had 66.
Oh, okay, and 66, and that's it, or not? I don't know.
Maybe for my paper, but if you look at an index to the Greek New Testament, you go to Isaiah, you will find what are called allusions, not quotations, but allusions to every chapter from 40 on to 66.
Okay, so if there are allusions which are clear allusions, that's okay.
Yeah, a lot of those are pretty clear, yeah.
Okay.
So they're using the whole thing, if that's what you're trying to get at. They're not just focused on this section or that chapter.
This is what I understood from the lecture, that you have these several quotations from several texts, and that's it, and all the rest.
No.
You know, okay. So if there are clear allusions to other do they have also to the first Isaiah? Or only?
Oh yes,
Okay.
but actually I think it's less drawn upon, because the latter are more eschatological, and there's this servant figure that's so important for the early Christian. So they do tend to latch on to that.
Okay. Thank you.
I do have, may I ask one question here, and I don't know the answer to it. If you look at the lives of the prophets, I think I'm right. In all the manuscripts, Isaiah is always first. And I think if you look at the church father lists, when they talk about the prophets, I think Isaiah is always first. I don't know the history of Septuagintal additions or anything else, but you know, in our Bibles today, my Bible I grew up with, Isaiah is the first prophet, and order often signifies something. So is there something in the history of where this book is placed that tells us about its importance?
Well, you have the three larger prophets, and then the 12 minor prophets. And the larger prophets come before the 12 minor prophets. And among the three larger prophets, Isaiah is the earliest, so that's why he's the first.
Okay. He's also the longest?
66 in Isaiah, 52 in Jeremiah, and 48 in Ezekiel.
So maybe it's just like Paul's letters. It's just Romans first, and we go to Philemon. It's long to short. But once they're in that order in people's minds, maybe that says something also. Isaiah is the first one there, like in the lives of the prophets. He's the one you talk about first, and you do everybody else. And isn't he always named before Jeremiah and Ezekiel when the names
Yes,
come up?
always.
Always.
With the minor prophet, it's a different story. There you have different traditions, and the question is, what is the organizing principle? But most scholars will say it's chronological. It doesn't work exactly. But for the three major prophets, it's clearly chronological.
But isn't there one place where the ordering of the prophets is different?
I don't remember for the three major prophets.
I think Jeremiah and Isaiah is in.
I don't remember. Doesn't mean that they're not true, but
One thing
Let's finish with this, and then we're gonna
Did,
call it a day
I have
later.
not heard anything yet about Isaiah being distinct from Jeremiah and Ezekiel in calling for more faith in God, rather than faith in foreign diplomacy, and where Ezekiel and Jeremiah seem to want to work with the other nations. Isaiah wants to say, no, only God will be our source of diplomacy. Is that not an argument that's made or there? Does Isaiah, and the question, does Isaiah ever agree to get in bed with the Assyrians and so forth? Or is he the one saying, no, let's not trust in our king and so forth with Assyria, let's trust in God? Whereas
I
Jeremiah,
don't know whether such deep theological understanding had any influence of people who arranged the sequence of the books.
I'm not worried about the sequence
Yeah, I
of
think
the
he's
books
just
as
talking
much
about
as just
theologically
the
speaking.
message of Isaiah and why it was so influential, whereas Jeremiah and Ezekiel seem to be more pragmatic in their foreign policy.
But this is not exactly correct, because in Isaiah 36, the message is of Rav Shakeh is don't count on God and don't count on Egypt, right? And these are exactly the two who saved Judah. So it's the Egyptians who came and God who came. So you cannot always say that Isaiah or what is in First Isaiah says, don't trust only in God and not in the nations. Because here you have clearly mocking that they trust in the nations, and then the nations come and save them.
Guys, let's put a stop right there.